Imagine Chicago, the 1920s. A guy from a poor Italian family transforms into one of the richest men in America in just a few years. His annual income reaches $100 million. That's more than $2 billion in today's money. He lives in luxury hotels, drives armored cars, and even the government can't stop him. His name is Alfonso Capone, but the whole world knows him as Al Capone. And the most amazing thing, he built all this wealth on selling something that was prohibited by law. On ordinary alcohol. But here's what's really interesting. Capone wasn't a criminal genius from birth. He didn't invent smuggling. He didn't create organized crime. Thousands of people were doing the same thing during Prohibition. So why did he become a legend? Why did his empire grow to such proportions? The answer doesn't lie in violence or luck. The answer lies in the financial schemes he used, in business strategies that were brilliant even by the standards of legitimate business. Today we'll break down how Al Capone's financial machine worked, what tricks he used to turn illegal alcohol trade into a multi-million-dollar empire, and most importantly, why these methods were so effective that it took the government years just to understand how it all worked. We're not going to romanticize crime. We're simply going to look at the cold numbers and schemes that turned a street thug into a financial magnate. So let's start from the very beginning. When Prohibition came into effect in America in 1920, most people thought it was a temporary inconvenience. The government banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Bars closed, breweries shut down, distilleries stopped operating. It seemed that an entire industry died overnight. But in reality, something completely different happened. The demand didn't disappear. People didn't stop wanting to drink. And that's where things get interesting. Imagine a market where demand remained the same, but legal supply dropped to zero. What happens to prices? Right, they skyrocket. Before Prohibition, a bottle of whiskey cost about $1. After the ban, the same bottle sold for $5, $10, or even $15. A markup of 10 to 15 times. That's the kind of money we're talking about. But Capone understood something that many of his competitors missed. It wasn't just about high prices. It was about controlling the entire supply chain. Most bootleggers of that time worked primitively. They bought alcohol somewhere in Canada or from local moonshiners, brought it into the city, and sold it in underground bars. Simple scheme. Buy cheap, sell expensive. But Capone built something different. He created a vertically integrated corporation that controlled every stage, from production to sale to the end consumer. And this was his first brilliant financial trick. Let's look at how this worked in practice. Capone didn't just buy alcohol from suppliers. He owned his own breweries and distilleries. This gave him complete control over costs. While his competitors were paying middlemen, he was producing drinks himself. Then he organized his own transportation network. Trucks, warehouses, security, everything was his. This meant he didn't depend on outside transportation companies and their rates. And finally, he owned a network of sales points, underground bars called speakeasies. Here's a concrete example. Producing a gallon of beer cost Capone about 50 cents. The wholesale price for an independent bar would be $3 to $4 per gallon. But Capone sold beer in his own establishments for $15 to $20 per gallon, poured by the mug, a markup of 40 times, and all this money stayed within his organization. Each stage of the chain brought profit, and this profit didn't leak to middlemen. This is a classic business strategy that the largest corporations use today. Vertical integration. Control over the entire value creation chain. But in the conditions of an illegal market, this strategy had an additional advantage. Every middleman in the chain is a potential point of failure. It's a person who could turn you into the police. The fewer outside people in your business, the fewer risks. Capone simultaneously maximized profit and minimized risks. This was economics and security in one package. Now you understand the first key principle of his success. Control over the supply chain gave him a huge financial advantage over competitors, but vertical integration is just the beginning. Because Capone faced a problem that any large business faces, legal or not. how to manage money, how to hide income, and how to turn mountains of cash into legitimate wealth. We'll talk about that next. So Capone has a huge money-making machine. Every week his organization receives hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, mostly small bills. Imagine this problem. You have a room stuffed with money and you can't just go and deposit it in a bank. If you come to a bank with a suitcase full of cash, questions will immediately start. Where's the money from? What business? Did you pay taxes? In the 20s, banks weren't yet required to report to authorities as thoroughly as now, but even then, large cash operations attracted attention. Capone needed to solve 3 tasks simultaneously. First, where to put the cash. Second, how to give his wealth an appearance of legality. Third, how to protect assets from confiscation if the authorities finally got to him. And here begins the second block of our story. The brilliant money laundering system through legitimate business, a system that became a model for criminal organizations for decades to come. The basic idea was simple. You need a legitimate business that works mainly with cash, a business where it's difficult to verify the real number of customers and real revenue. And Capone found the perfect solution, laundromats. Yes, ordinary self-service laundromats. In those days, this was a new, growing business. People came in, paid cash, washed their clothes, and left. No receipts, no records. Who can say how many customers really visited the laundromat in a day? 10 or 100? The scheme worked like this. Capone bought or opened laundromats all over Chicago. These establishments actually worked and served real customers. But in the financial reports, the number of customers and revenue were greatly inflated. A real laundromat brought in, say, $100 a day. But in the accounting books, they recorded $500. The difference of $400. This was money from alcohol sales, which now looked like legitimate income from washing clothes. This is where the term money laundering came from, by the way. Money was literally laundered through laundromats. But Capone went further. He understood that laundromats alone weren't enough. He needed a whole network of different legitimate businesses, and he started buying and opening everything. Furniture stores, car washes, pawn shops, bookmaking offices, hotels, restaurants. At the peak of his power, Capone's organization controlled hundreds of legitimate enterprises, and each of them served as a channel for laundering dirty money. Let's take a concrete example. One of Capone's most famous businesses, the Metropole Hotel in Chicago. This was a real operating hotel. Real guests stayed there. But the hotel was also used for money laundering. How? Very simple. Non-existent guests were recorded in the registration books. The room is supposedly occupied, the client pays cash, the money goes into the hotel's revenue. In reality, this was money from bootlegging. But on paper, everything looked clean. Legitimate business, legitimate income, taxes paid. And here's the key point. Capone actually paid taxes on his legitimate businesses. Not all of them, of course, but enough not to attract attention. He understood that the government wouldn't dig too deep if they saw you were paying at least some taxes. Small underpayments were normal for that time. Many legitimate businessmen underpaid taxes. As long as you're paying something, you're not first on the list for audit. This was another financial trick. Create an appearance of law-abidingness. Now, imagine the whole picture. Capone has an illegal business producing and selling alcohol. This business brings huge profits in cash. This money is pumped through dozens of legitimate enterprises where it mixes with legitimate revenue. Part of the money goes to paying taxes, which creates an appearance of legality. And at the end, Capone receives clean, legitimate money that he can freely use. Buy real estate, invest, put in the bank. Everything looks completely legal. But that's not all. Capone added another level of protection. Most of his businesses weren't registered in his name personally. He used front men. Formally, the owners of laundromats, hotels, and stores were some people from his organization, relatives, partners. Capone himself officially didn't appear anywhere as an owner. This is called using nominees or shell directors. Why is this needed? To protect assets. If the authorities come to arrest Capone and want to confiscate his property, they'll face a problem. On paper, he has almost nothing. Everything belongs to other people. Here's a concrete case that shows how effective this was. When federal agents began a serious investigation against Capone, they tried to compile a list of his assets. And you know what? They found almost nothing. Formally, only one major property was registered in Al Capone's name, his mansion in Miami. Everything else belonged to other people. Agents knew that Capone controlled hundreds of businesses, but proving it was almost impossible. Money flowed through such a complex network of companies and frontmen that untangling it was extremely difficult. Let's draw an intermediate conclusion. Capone created a system that performed several functions simultaneously. It laundered dirty money, turning it into legitimate income. It created an appearance of law-abidingness through paying taxes. It protected assets by hiding real ownership of businesses. And all this worked like a well-oiled mechanism. Hundreds of people in his organization knew their role. Accountants kept double books. Managers ran legitimate businesses. Front owners signed documents. This was a real corporation, just illegal. But even the most clever financial scheme is useless if you don't have control over territory. If other gangs can come and take your business, if the police can shut down your establishments at any moment, and here we move to the third block of our story, how Capone used money to buy power and influence. Because the real secret of his success wasn't just in the ability to make money, but in the ability to spend it the right way. In the world of illegal business, there's one big problem. You can't go to court if someone violated a contract. You can't call the police if someone stole your goods. The law doesn't protect illegal business. Therefore, criminal organizations create their own methods of protection. Usually, it's violence. You threaten, intimidate, kill competitors and violators. This works, but it's expensive and dangerous. Every act of violence attracts police attention. Every war between gangs gives authorities a reason for harsh actions. Capone used violence, let's not deny that. His organization was brutal. But his real genius showed in something else. He understood that violence is an extreme measure. It's much more effective to buy the system from within, turn potential enemies into allies, and he began a systematic campaign to corrupt authorities. He bribed police officers, judges, politicians, officials. He spent huge money on bribes and kickbacks. And these weren't random bribes. This was a thought-out system. Let's look at how this worked at the lower level. An ordinary police patrol in Chicago earned about $3,000 a year. This was a modest salary even by 20 standards. Now imagine that a person from Capone's organization approaches this policeman and offers an additional $200 a month just for warning about raids, or accidentally not noticing a truck with alcohol, or responding slowly to a call about an underground bar. $200 a month, that's almost doubling the salary. Many agreed, but Capone didn't limit himself to individual policemen. He worked with entire precincts. There's documentary evidence that some police precincts in Chicago received regular payments from Capone's organization, and not individual officers received them, but the entire precinct collectively. The money was divided among everyone, from the janitor to the captain. This created a circle of mutual responsibility. If the entire precinct is on Capone's payroll, no one will snitch, because it means losing money for everyone, but even this was only the beginning. Capone moved higher up the hierarchy of power. He bribed politicians. In those times in America, corruption was common, especially in big cities. Political machines controlled elections, and this required money, lots of money, for election campaigns, for bribing voters, for organizing rallies, and Capone generously financed the right candidates. He didn't directly ask them to cover his business. He just helped them win elections. And then these politicians owed him. Here's a concrete example. The mayor of Chicago in the 1920s, William Thompson, was known for his connections with organized crime. There's evidence that Capone actively financed his election campaign. How much money exactly was transferred is unknown, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what was the result? During Thompson's rule, Chicago police practically didn't touch Capone's business. Raids were conducted rarely and usually on competitors' properties. Capone's underground bars operated almost openly. This was protection at the highest level. But corruption isn't just bribes with money. Capone also used other methods of influence. He created the appearance of a legitimate businessman and philanthropist. During the Great Depression, he opened free soup kitchens for the poor. Thousands of people received free food thanks to Capone. Newspapers wrote about his charity. Ordinary people considered him their benefactor. This created popular support. And this support was a form of protection. It was harder for politicians to persecute someone the people considered a hero. Now, imagine the full picture. Capone has a powerful economic machine that produces huge money. This money is laundered through legitimate businesses. Part of the money goes to bribing authorities at all levels, from patrolmen to politicians. Part goes to charity, which creates a positive image. As a result, Capone gets practically complete immunity. He can conduct his business almost openly. His establishments work, his trucks transport alcohol, and nobody touches him. This isn't just a criminal organization. This is parallel power. And here's an important financial principle. Capone spent huge money on corruption. According to some estimates, up to 30% of his income went to bribes and kickbacks. That's millions of dollars annually. But these weren't expenses. These were investments. Every bribed policeman, every bought politician, this was protection for the entire business. And this protection paid off 100-fold. Because while the authorities don't touch your business, you can work calmly and earn. Compare this with Capone's competitors. Many gangs spent money on weapons, on thugs, on wars with other groups. These were also big expenses, but they didn't create long-term protection. Killing a competitor is a solution for one day. Tomorrow someone else will come. But buying a police precinct or a politician is protection for years. Capone understood this earlier than others. He wasn't just building a gang. He was building a system that was integrated into the city's power structures. But this strategy had one problem. It only worked at the local level. Capone could control Chicago. He could bribe local police and local politicians. But he couldn't control the federal government. And when the feds finally decided to seriously deal with him, his entire protection system cracked. Because federal agents didn't report to local authorities, they couldn't be bought so easily. And they were looking for a way to get Capone where he was most vulnerable. So we've come to the final part. We've analyzed 3 main financial strategies of Capone: vertical integration of the entire chain of alcohol production and sales, a money laundering system through a network of legitimate businesses, and buying power through massive corruption. Each of these strategies was brilliant in itself. But together, they created an almost invulnerable empire. Capone earned huge money, legalized it, and protected his business from competitors and authorities. But every system has a weak point, and Capone's weak point turned out to be precisely money. The irony of fate, a man who built a brilliant financial empire was ultimately caught precisely on finances, because despite all his cleverness, he made one critical mistake. He underestimated accountants and tax collectors. In the late 1920s, the federal government realized that catching Capone for illegal alcohol trade was practically impossible. The protection system was too well built. Witnesses were afraid to talk. Evidence disappeared. Cases fell apart in court. But there was one person who proposed a different approach. His name was Eliot Ness, and he led a special group of federal agents called the Untouchables. Ness understood that Capone needed to be fought not as a gangster, but as a tax evader. And then real financial detective work began. Agents started collecting documents. They studied bank records. They interviewed employees of Capone's legitimate businesses. They checked accounts, receipts, payment slips. They reconstructed financial flows piece by piece. And gradually, the picture began to clear. Capone lived like a millionaire. He spent huge money on luxury, but at the same time, he paid almost no income taxes. In tax returns, Capone indicated minimal amounts or didn't file returns at all. And this was his mistake. Let's look at the numbers. In 1924, Capone didn't file a tax return at all. In 25, he indicated an income of $5,000. In 26, zero again. And during this time, he was buying real estate, expensive cars, clothing for thousands of dollars. He lived in luxury hotels and spent money left and right. Federal agents began collecting evidence of his real expenses. And it turned out that Capone spent several $1 million over 6 years without paying a cent in taxes on them. In 1931, Capone was charged with tax evasion, not for alcohol trade, not for murders, not for extortion, for taxes. And it worked, because proving tax evasion turned out to be much easier than proving his involvement in crimes. No witnesses were needed who could be intimidated. Accounting documents were enough. Numbers don't lie. And the numbers clearly showed. Capone received huge income and didn't pay taxes. Capone's trial was a sensation. The prosecution presented mountains of documents. They showed that Capone should have paid more than $200,000 in taxes. This was a huge amount for those times. The defense tried to prove that the government couldn't accurately establish the sources of Capone's income, but the prosecution didn't need that. It was enough for them to prove the very fact of income and non-payment of taxes. The source doesn't matter. Even if you earned money criminally, you're obligated to pay taxes on it. Such is the paradox of American legislation. In October 1931, the jury found Capone guilty on several counts of tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in prison and a fine of $50,000 plus all unpaid taxes. This was the maximum possible sentence for those charges. Capone's empire collapsed, not from competitors' bullets, not from police raids, but from tax collectors' accounting calculations. The man who created a brilliant money laundering system couldn't properly fill out tax returns. What conclusions can we draw from Al Capone's story? The first and most important, financial literacy is more important than force. Capone became a legend, not because he was the most brutal. There were more brutal gangsters. He became a legend because he understood how money works, how to build business structures, how to manage financial flows, how to protect assets. His organization was essentially a corporation, just illegal. And that's what made it so powerful and durable. Second conclusion, any business, legal or not, is built on the same principles. Cost control, vertical integration to reduce dependence on suppliers, risk diversification through many different assets, investments in business protection. All these principles work equally whether in a legal corporation or a criminal organization. Capone applied methods that are described today in any business administration textbook. Third conclusion, laundering money through legitimate business isn't just a way to hide income, it's a way of integrating into the economy. Capone understood that you can't build a long-term empire only on a legal business. You need a legal facade, you need legal assets, you need an appearance of law-abidingness, and his network of laundromats, hotels, stores created exactly that. He was becoming part of the legal economy, which gave him additional protection and respect. Fourth conclusion, corruption can be an effective business strategy, but only up to a certain limit. Capone was able to buy local power. He controlled Chicago police and local politicians. But he couldn't buy the federal government. When the feds seriously took him on, his entire protection system proved useless. This shows the limitations of a corruption strategy. It works locally, but not globally. Fifth, and perhaps the most ironic conclusion, any system is vulnerable in details. Capone built an incredibly complex and thought-out financial empire. But he missed one small detail, tax returns. He thought that if he hid the sources of income, tax collectors wouldn't be able to get to him. But American tax legislation doesn't require proving the source of income. It's enough to prove the very fact of income and non-payment of taxes. This small legal nuance destroyed his entire empire. Another important lesson, the appearance of legality is important, but insufficient. Capone created the image of a law-abiding businessman. He paid part of his taxes, he engaged in charity, he gave interviews in which he presented himself as an ordinary entrepreneur. But this turned out to be insufficient because the numbers said otherwise. His expenses far exceeded his declared income, and no matter how much he portrayed law-abidingness, mathematics was against him. Let's also talk about the scale of his operations. At the peak of his power, Capone's organization controlled about 1,000 employees. He had a clear hierarchy. He divided Chicago into districts, each had its own manager. He had specialists in different areas: production, transportation, sales, security, finance, relations with authorities. This was a real corporate structure, and it was precisely this organization that allowed him to manage such a huge volume of operations. It's also interesting to look at what happened after Capone's arrest. His organization didn't disappear immediately. For some time it continued to work under the leadership of other people, but without Capone, it began to fall apart. Why? Because he wasn't just a boss, he was a system-forming element. He built connections, negotiated, planned strategy. His successors were good executors, but they lacked his financial mind and strategic thinking. This shows how important the leader's role is in any organization. There's another aspect that's important to mention. Capone became possible thanks to prohibition. This was a law that contradicted the desires of millions of people. People wanted to drink alcohol, but the law forbade it. And this created a huge black market. Capone simply filled the void created by a stupid law. This is a lesson for lawmakers. Prohibitions that don't take reality into account create crime, not eradicate it. When prohibition was repealed in 1933, the illegal alcohol industry began to die. Capone was already in prison by then, but even if he had been free, his business model would have stopped working. Legal companies returned to the market, prices fell, the super profits that made bootlegging so attractive disappeared. Many former bootleggers left the business or switched to other illegal goods, drugs, gambling, prostitution. And what happened to Capone himself? He served 8 years out of 11 and was released in 1939. But this was no longer the same Capone. In prison, he contracted third-stage syphilis, which affected his brain. He spent his last years in his Miami mansion practically incapacitated. His financial empire had crumbled by then. Money went to fines, legal costs, supporting his family. The man who once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars died in 1947, leaving a relatively modest estate. Another lesson: criminal money rarely brings long-term prosperity, but Capone's influence on organized crime remained forever. His methods, vertical integration, laundering through legitimate business, systemic corruption, became the standard for all major criminal organizations. The Italian mafia, Mexican cartels, Russian organized groups, they all use in one form or another the principles that Capone developed. He didn't invent organized crime, but he turned it into real business with clear structure and financial discipline. There's another interesting point. Capone was one of the first who understood the power of publicity. He didn't hide from the press. On the contrary, he gave interviews, was photographed, created his public image. He understood that fame is also a form of protection. The more public you are, the harder it is to quietly eliminate you. And the more people know and support you, the more political costs authorities have from your persecution. This strategy was later used by many criminals and even quite legal businessmen. Now let's talk about what this story means for us today. The world has changed. Prohibition is gone. Technologies for controlling finances have become much more advanced. Banks are required to report suspicious operations. Tax services have access to huge data arrays. Laundering money through a simple laundromat is almost impossible today. Tracking systems have become too good, but the principles that Capone used haven't gone anywhere. Vertical integration still remains a powerful business strategy. The world's largest corporations strive to control the entire chain from production to sales. Apple controls hardware, software, and retail stores. Amazon controls warehouses, logistics, sales platform. This is the same principle that Capone used, just in legal format. Money laundering also hasn't gone anywhere. Methods have just become more complex. Now offshore companies are used, complex schemes with multiple jurisdictions, cryptocurrencies, fictitious trade operations, but the essence is the same. Take illegal money and give it an appearance of legality. Tax authorities around the world fight this but can't completely win because financial schemes constantly evolve. Corruption also remains a reality in many countries. Methods have become more veiled. Now it's not just envelopes with money. It's consulting contracts, charitable foundations, services to relatives, positions after leaving politics. But the principle is the same. Use money to buy influence and protection. And this still works, especially in countries with weak institutions. What can we take from Capone's story as ordinary people who aren't planning to engage in crime? First, understanding how money and financial systems work. Capone was financially literate. He understood value creation chains, markups, costs, risks. This knowledge is useful in any business. Second, the importance of proper documentation and reporting. Capone got caught precisely on neglecting paperwork. In legitimate business, proper record-keeping and paying taxes isn't just a formality, it's protection from problems. Third, understanding that any system has weak points. Capone built strong protection from local authorities, but didn't account for the federal level. In business, it's also important to look at the whole picture and not miss weak links. Fourth, the importance of reputation and public image. Capone understood the power of publicity. In the modern world, reputation is expensive. Companies spend huge money on PR and reputation management. This isn't foolishness. This is a real business asset. And finally, Capone's story shows that short-term success doesn't guarantee long-term prosperity. He was at the top for less than 10 years. Then, prison, illness, oblivion. Building something truly solid is only possible on a legal basis. Criminal money comes quickly, but leaves even faster, and rarely brings happiness. Capone earned hundreds of millions. But what did he get in the end? A few years of luxury, then prison and decrepitude. Not the best life. So what can we say in conclusion? Al Capone was a financial genius who applied his talents in the criminal sphere. His methods were so effective that they're still studied and copied today. He showed that organized crime can work like a real corporation with clear structure, financial discipline, and long-term strategy. But he also showed the limitations of the criminal path. You can earn huge money illegally, but you can't keep it for long. The system gets you sooner or later. His story is both a lesson and a warning. The lesson is that financial literacy and strategic thinking can create an empire from nothing. The warning is that an empire built on the sand of illegality will inevitably collapse. It's just a matter of time. Capone was smarter, more cunning, and more organized than most of his competitors. But even he couldn't deceive the system forever. If you're interested in the topic of financial schemes and how money works in legal and illegal business, I recommend studying this topic more deeply. Read books on the history of organized crime. Study how modern money laundering methods work and how they're fought against. Understand your country's tax legislation. Learn the basics of corporate structures and financial accounting. All this is knowledge that will be useful in legitimate business. The main thing, remember that financial literacy is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for creation or destruction. Capone chose destruction and ultimately destroyed himself. You can choose creation and build something truly valuable and durable. The principles of how money works are the same for a criminal as for a legitimate entrepreneur. But the consequences are completely different. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories about how money and financial systems work. Give it a like if it was interesting. Write in the comments about what other historical figures and their financial schemes you'd like to hear about. Maybe the Medici and their banking empire, or John Rockefeller and creating an oil monopoly, or modern oligarchs and their methods. Share your thoughts. See you in the next videos. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to money.